the House will proceed to public business. The motion before the House is the Huxley Memorial Debate that the doctrine of creation is more valid than the theory of evolution. And the speakers, Theodore Wilson, Regent's Park Standing Committee, Emma Jenks, Trinity Treasurer, Professor Edgar Andrews, Queen Mary College, London, Dr. Richard Dawkins, New College, Peter Ross, New College, Daniella Sief, New College, Professor Arthur Wilder Smith, Professor of Pharmacology and consultant from Geneva, and Professor Maynard Smith, Professor of Biology, University of Sussex. Teller for the eyes is Bob Barlow, New College, and teller for the nose, Barbara Hammond Schamberger, St. Catherine's. This is a New College debate. Tellers will take up their places at the conclusion of the Honourable Opposer's speech and will remain until called upon to withdraw. Honourable members wishing to vote after the tellers have taken up their position may do so by walking through one of the doors marked ayes and noes. Any honourable member who wishes to abstain from voting should notify the tellers. I would like to remind honourable members that they may vote only once. Should they require to leave the chamber more than once, kindly inform the tellers that you have already voted. I would also like to remind the honourable members that of late, at times the House has fallen into the habit of calling honourable members by their first names. Under the rules of the Society, kindly refer to other members as either the honourable member or the honourable speaker. And without any further ado, I call on Theodore Wilson's Regent's Park and Standing Committee to propose the motion standing in his name.
Madam President, I said in a letter to you in Hillary term of last year when I heard you speak for the first time that you were one of the best speakers that I had ever seen and I had ever heard. And I say that this Hillary to you in person. I also would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. And at this time, I would like to introduce the guests for this evening. On the opposition side, we have the Honorable Treasurer, Emma Jenks, who happens to be my neighbor. We have Dr. Richard Dawkins from New College, the zoologist and renowned author. We have Daniella Sief from New College and contributor to Debate magazine. We also have Professor John Maynard Smith, the Professor of Biology of the University of Sussex. Now on the proposition side, with me, we have Professor Edgar Andrews, Queen's Mary College, London. We have Peter Ross, New College. We have Professor Arthur Wilder Smith, Professor of Pharmacology and consultant from Geneva. I'd like to say at this time that I know that this is a very hot issue, and so I want to make it perfectly clear that I don't come here tonight as a Bible thumper or a scripture quoter, for this is not a church but a debating chamber, and this is not a pulpit but a debating dispatch box. Nor think that we on this side of the House represent the radical right Falwellian fundamentalists. Truly, we accept the recent findings of archaeologists. We now know that in the beginning, the earliest man was a man by the name of Keeble Man. Keeble Man had no form of communication, and so all that he could do was just make gestures and grunts. Then after Keeble Man came Oriole Man. Now Oriole Man developed a primitive tribal culture which was known as rowing. But the big breakthrough came with Pembroke Man. Pembroke Man was the first person to be able to use words, but unfortunately not in the right order. Now all of these type of men unfortunately died out because they were unable to procreate. You see, unlike us on this side of the house, they were
Honourable Member, sir, I am an Oriole man. And I can speak. Thank you very much.
Honourable members, I come forward to say that this motion before you this evening should not be perceived as a debate of fact over fiction, or fantasy over reality. The motion, as it is read, if somebody can pick it up, let's look at it together. Let's make sure that we see what it says. It says that the doctrine of creation is more valid than the theory of evolution. We're not discussing two conflicting doctrines, and we're not talking about two conflicting theories. One is a doctrine, the other is a theory. No doubt, the reason that I say that is to say this, that both those who believe in the theory of evolution and those who believe in the doctrine of creation each have something to say. One makes an attempt to explain how we got here. Another makes an attempt to explain why we are here. In many respects, the two are very complementary. And perhaps that's why Dr. Martin Luther King once said that science keeps religion from sinking into the valley of crippling irrationalism, and religion prevents science from falling into the marshes of moral nullism. The doctrine of creation is a declaration of faith. It is a declaration that concerns the existence of men and women here and now. It is a doctrine that gives a spiritual explanation for what scientists have tried to give an intellectual explanation. It is a doctrine that gives a mental picture of why things as they were transformed into the way they are now. It is a descriptive, picturesque account of why the cornerstone of the universe was laid, of why the stars are the silver splendor of space, of why the measurements were set for the foundation of earth. It is a doctrine that points to something greater than ourselves as the source for all that is and all that is to come. It is a doctrine that puts this terrestrial ball and all that are on it under the microscope of purpose. For what is life without purpose? Aristotle called it the unmoved mover. Plato called it the supreme form of the good. It is not a wonder then that Immanuel Kant said that without a moral, you cannot make any moral sense of the universe without a doctrine of creation. No person on this side of the house would be foolish enough to say that everything in the theory of evolution is wrong. I hope not. But I stand on this side of the house not to support the teaching of the banning of evolution in schools, nor do I believe that fossils were planted solely to test one's faith in God, nor do I believe that it was to undermine one's faith by Lucifer, are purely the remains of animals caught in the great flood. Truly, these are the most bogus ideas that I've ever heard, and they're the tenets of only a few. Those who are not rational enough to take and accept from the evolutionist theory that which is true and decipher from it that which is false. Yet still, too many have tried to criticize, nitpick, and downplay the doctrine of creation as being merely a second-rate theory held by those religious dogmatists who blind themselves to the truth. The people on this side of the house would not deny any observed, documented biological changes that those on that side of the house wish to make for the representation of their stand. Those who support the doctrine of creation can accept microevolution. What is questionable, however, is macroevolution. It is true that environmental surroundings can transform and instigate changes with certain particular species, but is it true that environmental surroundings can transform a certain species into another species? It has been true that environmental surroundings also can, through environmental surroundings, you can change things like, for instance, moths. Transmutations of light moths into brown moths. But does it follow then that environmental surroundings also can make transmutations from moths to dragonflies? Of course not. Moths are no more than moths, monkeys are no more than monkeys, and man is no more than man. Man might act like an ape, eat like a pig, look like a goat, think like a jackass, be as stubborn as a mule, or as ugly as the Honorable Secretary. But a man is still a man and has been that way all through recorded history. Now, Professor Dawkins is going to undoubtedly tell us that 1,000 years or the thousands of years of recorded history is not enough sufficient time to manifest any evolutionary process. He's going to tell this House that millions of years were required for certain kinds of living species. Now that's what he's going to tell you. What he means is that although if put to the test, we cannot explain or show evolutionary process, you should accept it just as a fact. That is not scientific fact, that's scientific faith. You can't have it both ways. You can't accuse theologians of being without facts and then turn around and use your scientific theory based upon faith. Madam President, I tell you and I tell this House, that is scientific faith. Professor Dawkins wrote in an article in New Scientist that Charles Darwin showed how it was possible for blind physical forces to mimic the effects of conscious design. That is like the university press having an explosion of ink and coming up with the dictionary. The odds against that happening are 10 to the 40,000 power. I'm not a betting man, but I certainly wouldn't want to bet on those odds. Miss Sief, even in her article, The Debate magazine, I admire you for being reasonable enough to point out that the sparsity of the fossil records. And true, you are right to do so. For when one considers that the total number of fossils is close to 100,000, and out of which basically only the horse and the elephant have any morphological sequence, where is the proof for any major assumptions of transmutation? Where is the proof? Madam Treasurer, when you stand on the opposing side for this motion, explain to this House how the second law of thermodynamics, which gives the reason why organisms die out and things wear out, is exactly converse to the principles of evolution. Show us, Professor Smith, why matter arose from non-living matter. Show us how spontaneous generation could occur only once. Show us how viruses, bacteria, plants, animals, and men are all related. Show us this proof. Give us the ocular proof. The fact of the matter is that you can't. As Michael Denton said, the molecular biologist pointed out in his book, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, there it is right there. Even Darwin had to admit that he had absolutely no hardcore empirical data, no concrete evidence, no substantial scientific fact, nothing to prove any of the major evolutionary transformations he asserted. It was Darwin, the author of the evolutionary theory himself, that confessed in a letter to Ossie Gray on the 5th of September, 1857, and I quote, "One's imagination must fill up the very blanks." Honorable members, with testimony like this from the author himself, I submit that the theory of evolution is lacking in facts, but not in imagination. It is a convincing scientific account, but not convincing in the sense that it's confused. And I'm confused on this point. The doctrine of creation, however, is important because it gives us a purpose. It explains something that scientific theory could not, even if it wanted to. We on this side of the House are not blind to the truth. Rather, it is that we agree with Darwin's associate, Thomas Huxley, who in the debate in 1860 said that I would prefer to be the descendant of a humble monkey than of those men who employ their knowledge and eloquence in misrepresenting those who are wearing out their lives in the search of truth. Honorable members, theology, philosophy, those that happen to be in those disciplines are in the search of the truth. We try to explain things in the why as opposed to the how. And I beg to propose this motion.
I would like announce the results of the special private business meeting. The House called for the expulsion of Major Sanderson. Black, 4, 109 voted in favour, 31 voted against the motion. Therefore, the motion is carried. I would like to thank Theodore Wilson very much indeed for that maiden speech. And I now call upon Emma Jenks, Trinity Treasurer, also in her maiden speech.
This may, Madam President, be my maiden speech, but of course it may not be my last this term. I am very honoured to be speaking opposite Theodore Wilson tonight. The difference between his speech and mine is that mine has evolved over millions of years, while his was created in 4004 BC. It's a pity he hasn't had time to translate it out of the original Sanskrit. Madam President, in a week that has seen the release of Anatoly Sharansky, the near release of Nelson Mandela, the introduction of union-style elections in the Philippines, and the announcement of Mark Carnegie's third presidential campaign, how appropriate that you should confront this society with a controversy that was raging in the 1850s. I'm surprised you didn't make it an emergency motion. Firstly, I would like to make it very clear that speaking on this side of the House, I do not deny the existence of God. Secondly, I know that everything an evolutionist can say may be countered by the creationist saying, God did it that way. The most extreme fundamentalists argue that it is sinful to attempt to explain any form of revelation, which makes scientific inquiry something opposed to God's will. It is worth remembering that the author, or authors of Genesis, were doing the same thing that we're doing, trying to explain a process which was a complete mystery. The authors of Genesis may well have had divine inspiration, but who is to say that Charles Darwin was not similarly inspired? Some creationists would argue that they are not dogmatic. They argue that creationism is a science. But in order to be scientific, their claims must be verifiable. But even the most scientific claims of the creationists are unverifiable, because the intervention of God is an essential component in their argument. But who can prove that God has acted? Creation is a mystery beyond inquiry. The process of evolution is not and can be studied, hence its superior validity in the context of this debate. Fleming, who is from the creationist school, has written a book entitled Is God's Bible the Greatest Murder Mystery Ever Written?, in which he argues with little fact but much flamboyance that dinosaurs and other extinct organisms have never existed, but were created as fossils in the earth to demonstrate the wit of God. This is the worst of dogmatic religion, in that it combines a refusal to face with reality with a mechanism that means one never has to do so. I can only appeal tonight to the rational members of the House, and I believe those rational members to see quite clearly that if God created the world, he would not have done it by blurring fact and illusion. It is not part of God's nature to deliberately deceive us. And I'm sure the other side of the House will agree. Another point I would like to raise with the creationists is their insistence that God is bounded by time. That if the Bible says he created the world in 6 days, He literally did. What they fail to remember is that God transcends time, and in his terms, days are meaningless. Up until now, I have been trying to examine a coherent doctrine of creation, an impossible task. I am not going to pull the Bible apart. Attacking the words in the Bible as a coherent theory of how species came into being was a valid way of debating the issue over 100 years ago. What's happening now? The creationists have been reduced to poking holes in evolution rather than producing a coherent case for themselves. I have to rebuff the attacks being made on one of the greatest scientific insights of the last 200 years. That insight was that over time, species evolve and some become extinct in response to environmentally selective pressures on naturally diverse populations. The population's diversity having been produced by randomly generated mutations. That, as the axiom of evolution, stands as the thing which governs all that we see in the natural kingdom. How did the process start? A concept, an enigma, a conundrum. How did life evolve? We just don't know. But what we do know is that conditions on Earth before life evolved have been replicated in the laboratory. The primeval soup and the massive electrical storms. Lo and behold, what are produced are amino and nucleic acids, the basic components of life. But that's not life itself, argue the creationists. The fact that a virus, for the contention that life could have arisen randomly in the 10 million years or so, where the conditions were conducive to its generation.
How do we know the conditions were like that before?
We just don't know. We on this side are grappling with the same phenomena as the other side of the house. We are both trying to explain the great mystery of life, but we're not trying to ignore the facts. Finally, I would like to refer you to a text with which I'm sure you're all very familiar, the Second Vatican Council minutes of 1968. And I quote, "Today, as never before perhaps, there is a clear possibility of profound agreement between true science and true faith, both of which are servants of the one and only truth. The difference between us and the other side of the house is that we are trying to reach that truth with the help of one of God's greatest gifts, reason. I beg to oppose."
Professor Edgar Andrew, Queen Mary College, London, to speak third and in favour of the motion.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, I will not in any way attempt to refute the words of the honourable opposer of the motion, except simply to say that she has erected a very attractive straw man and perhaps has done him some degree of injury. But let me begin by defining what I at least mean by the doctrine of creation and the theory of evolution. By the doctrine of creation, I mean that view that attributes origins, whether they be cosmological, biological or anthropological, to the work of a spiritual being, namely God. It further asserts that that work, that creative work of God, is something that lies beyond the power of science to explain. There is nothing in creationism that is inimical to science. I, after all, am a scientist myself. But creationism, or the doctrine of creation, does assert that there are certain things, and in particular these creative acts of God, that by their very nature lie beyond the grasp of science. And therefore much of what I have to say this evening will be directed at delineating the limitations of science. Now, when we turn to the theory of evolution and seek to define that, I would say that it is a theory that seeks to explain origins in terms of natural process alone, without divine intervention. I want to emphasize that aspect of evolution because I want to avoid us doing two things. I want to keep the definition of evolution very general, because I want to avoid, first of all, our getting bogged down with the many detailed arguments that are involved as we consider the different theories of evolution that have been proposed. For evolution is not monolithic. It is not a single theory. The neo-Darwinian theory is, of course, the currently most favored. But there are also the neo-Lamarckians, those who are reviving Lamarck's ideas that the development of life has occurred by the inheritance of acquired characteristics, a thing that Darwinism, of course, denies. And then, of course, we have those who subscribe to punctuated equilibrium. These, too, are evolutionists, but they are very largely paleontologists, the students of the fossil record, who have come to realize that the fossil record does not tell Darwin's story. They have come to realize that the gaps in the fossil record and the absence of precursor and intermediate forms are such as can no longer be ignored. And they have therefore set aside the idea that the fossil record tells the story of evolution and are proposing that evolution, in fact, occurred off the record, relatively rapidly and in localized regions, so that the fossil record does in fact not contain the story of evolution at all. Not only do we have the Darwinians and the Lamarckians and the punctuated equilibrists, but we also have the theistic evolutionists. Now, I want you to particularly note that I'm placing theistic evolution alongside the other evolutionary theories. Theistic evolution, of course, is an attempt to reconcile creation and evolution. The idea is that God did indeed create all things, but that he used the evolutionary process in order to do so. Now, all of these evolutionary viewpoints have one thing in common, including theistic evolution. And that one thing they have in common is the desire to ascribe all things that we see and know and recognize today, the entire cosmos in all its aspects, as the outcome of natural process alone. And it is at this point, I believe, that we must join the debate this evening. Is it possible to explain all things by means of natural process, the normal workings of the laws of science, if you like? Or are there areas of human experience, and are there areas of origins where natural process fails totally to account for the facts as we know them?
Can I point out that the motion of the planets came into the category of those processes which natural events failed to account for before the time of Galileo? After Galileo, they came into the realm of science. After the dark time of Darwin, the origins of man came into the realm of science.
Thank you. I want to emphasize that point at which the debate will, I think, be joined, the distinction between natural process as an all-explanatory theory or purpose, and the creation concept in which there are things that have to be accepted and believed and have occurred as a result of divine fiat and power, and not by natural process. Now, I want to illustrate my point and try to prove it by referring to four things which I believe science can never explain. And let me say at this point that when I say science can never explain these things, I mean exactly that. It is always possible to argue, of course, that next week or next month or in a decade or in 100 years, science will have advanced and progressed to the point where things that are now inexplicable by science will then be explicable. Now, I do not deny that there is a great deal that science has yet to uncover, discover, and explain. I sincerely hope that that is the fact, because I, for one, would be out of a job if it were not. But there are things, I believe, that cannot be explained scientifically, that cannot be ascribed to natural process by their very nature. And I want to mention four of those. First of all, science cannot explain ultimate origins. Now, no doubt many of you are familiar with the theory of the Big Bang, the concept of the origin of our universe in a primordial explosion of unimaginable dimensions. It is not simply the idea that there was an explosion within the universe, within a pre-existing space-time continuum, but rather that the universe itself and space itself and time itself were in those initial moments of the universe confined to an incredibly small dimension. This gigantic explosion has produced the universe as we know it, and it is possible mathematically to trace back the history of the universe to those early moments of its existence. Let us remember, of course, that this is but a theory. It is called by the astrophysicists responsible for it the standard model of the universe, and they emphasize that it is but a model. Now, in that model, you can extrapolate mathematically back to the first 3 minutes of the universe. You can describe the state and condition of the universe when it was no larger than a tennis ball. You can go back even further. You can extrapolate back to the first few seconds, to the first 1,000th of a second. But you can never, by the exercise of scientific theory or the use of mathematics, reach time zero. You are met at that point by a philosophical dilemma. And I can state it in this fashion.
Miss Honourable Speaker, there is a scientific theory called the new inflationary model, which, although it does not explain in its full glory the total creation, does explain how the universe could have been created at time zero.
Right. There are many theories and many speculations indeed on these matters. I've referred to the Big Bang theory. There is also a theory which we might call the little whimper theory, which refers to the slow and gradual origin of matter by the creation of matter-antimatter pairs. But nevertheless, I would maintain that there is a philosophical dilemma the moment we approach the zero time point. And that is as follows. If the laws of nature that control the universe came into being at the moment the universe came into being, then by definition they could not have been the cause of the universe's origin. If alternatively the laws that control the universe pre-existed the creation of the universe, then they must have existed within some matrix. On what parchment were they written? In what stones were they engraved? Science cannot answer that question. Theology can answer that question. For the doctrine of creation states that before there ever was any space, any time, any matter, any energy, any scientific or natural law, there was God. That God is a self-existent, eternal person, that he is pure spirit, and that it was at his will and at his command that the material universe, with its space and its time and its matter and its energy and its laws, came into being. Science cannot answer questions about the ultimate origin of the universe. Now, the second thing that science cannot do is to explain itself. Now, you ask me what I mean by that. And this is what I mean by that. That science consists very largely in natural law. There is a sense in which one can reduce science, both as a body of information and as a practice, as an activity, to the issue of natural law. Scientists discover natural laws. They try to develop natural laws. They try to understand the connection between natural laws. They try to test natural laws, and if they are in the field of applied science, they try to put natural law to work for the benefit of mankind. Science is all about natural law. If there were no natural law, there would be no science. And yet science must remain forever silent on why natural laws take the form that they do. Let me illustrate this by referring to a law that I'm sure we're all familiar with, the law of gravity. Now, the law of gravity is what is referred to as an inverse square law. That is to say, the force between two massive bodies varies inversely as the square of the distance between them. It is not an inverse cube law, and the force does not vary as 1 divided by the distance to the power 2.1 or 1.9. It is precisely and exactly and eternally an inverse square law. Now, if we ask the question, why should that be? Which is, I believe, a perfectly legitimate question to ask, then science can never give an answer. Science must say, we take nature as it is. Science is descriptive of nature. It is not prescriptive of nature. Science must take the law as it is. And that is what I mean when I say that science can never explain itself. Now, I believe that theology can do what science cannot do. If I walk along a beach covered with millions upon millions of pebbles, and I pick up one pebble from amongst those millions of pebbles, I have made a choice, a selection, and thereby I have left unchosen and unselected a million alternative possibilities. I believe that is exactly what God has done in establishing the laws of nature. The fact that the law of gravity is one particular law out of an infinitude of possible laws, to me, speaks of choice. It speaks of selection. The Bible says that Christ upholds all things by the word of his power. Science would say, of course, that all things are upheld by the laws of nature, and that is a perfectly legitimate statement within a scientific context. The laws of nature, therefore, according to biblical teaching, are the word of God's power. They are there, and they take the form that they do, because God wills them to be there, and he wills them to take that form. Once again, I suggest that where science comes to its legitimate limit, where it comes to an end of its ability to explain, we find that the doctrine of creation can take us further and provide not half an explanation of being, but a full and satisfying one. The third area where I believe science is incapable of providing an explanation is perhaps a more controversial one. But I would suggest that science is incapable ever of explaining the origin of life. Now, there isn't time, certainly not for me, to go into the details of the theory of chemical evolution. Entire books have been written upon the subject for it and against it. But I do want to focus upon one particular aspect, and that is the fact that all life is dependent upon the genetic code. All life is dependent upon a code. That code is written, as many of you know, upon the DNA molecules which reside in every living cell. They make up the genes which control the growth and development and characteristics of any organism. Now, that code is not unlike the Morse code, except that it uses 4 symbols instead of 2. And just like the Morse code, or indeed any alphabet or any code, it is capable of conveying meaningful information. Now, the one point I want to make, and I believe that other honourable speakers later in the debate may take this matter further, the one point I want to make is that life depends upon code and information conveyed by that code. And I would submit that it is impossible for code to arise from chaos, for meaningful information to be generated by random chemical combination, for significance to arise out of meaninglessness. It is this aspect that makes me believe that the creation, the origin of life, is incapable of explanation and will forever remain incapable of explanation by science. The fourth, do I have to? The fourth thing that I want to say, the fourth area in which I believe science will forever be incapable of providing an explanation, I beg your pardon, the interruption moved my thoughts away. Let me, before I move on to the fourth point, say simply this, that once again, where science cannot explain the origin of code and information from random or chance events, theology once again can provide the answer. The astronomers, Boyle and Wick-Grammer-Singer, have put forward theories which are generally rejected by the scientific community. Indeed, I don't accept them myself, but I want to refer to their work because they studied from a purely scientific point of view, they had no religious axe to grind at all, the possibilities, the chances of the spontaneous creation or spontaneous happening, occurrence of life. Those chances are remote. But I simply want to point out that having studied those possibilities, they decided that it was not possible for life to have arisen accidentally or by random chemical process upon Earth during the entire history of the Earth. Well then, they thought they had an answer. They suggested that life might have arisen in space instead, and the advantage of that was, from their point of view, that it gave them a few more thousands of millions of years for it to happen. But having published that view, they later came to a final conclusion that life could not have arisen spontaneously during the entire history of the universe. And they were driven, despite their atheistical position, driven to the conclusion that it was necessary for an intelligent being to have created life because of the information content of living things. Now I quote them simply to illustrate that scientists who are reasoning only from a scientific point of view have been driven to this conclusion. Let me move on to the fourth point. And my fourth and final point is that science can never explain the phenomenon of mind. The phenomenon of mind. Now we are all aware, I hope, that there is something rather different about man. I doubt very much whether there is anywhere in the world tonight a debate going on amongst an assembly of dingoes or elephants or porpoises concerning the nature of their origins. There is something different about man. The evolutionist Dawkins referred to the biological uniqueness of man as one of the greatest problems facing evolutionary theory. We have, as a race, the capacity of self-knowledge, the capacity for thought, the capacity for reason. Animals, of course, possess intelligence in many respects, but there is something totally unique about the human mind. Now, the creationist says that is self-evident, because man is made in the image of God. But the evolutionist, unless at this point he deviates from his evolutionism and becomes covertly a special creationist, the evolutionist is unable to account for the origin of mind, except as a byproduct, an emanation, almost perhaps a waste product of an organ called the brain. Evolution acts upon, if it acts at all, upon physical organs and physical organisms. And so one can, of course, advance the concept of the evolution of an organ called the brain. But mind, if it is simply the result of such an evolution, whilst perhaps endowing survival value, nevertheless is essentially meaningless and irrational. Mind, as the chance product of the evolution of the brain, despite any survival value it might have, is essentially without meaning and without significance. So perhaps we are all wasting our time here, putting our arguments forward for and against. I don't quite know how to take that applause. There is one very interesting thing, however, about mind, and that is the way in which it interacts with or fits the universe in which we live. The very fact that there is such a thing as science means that we have a... I was given up to 40 minutes.
This is the President.
I started at 9:05. Half an hour. Okay. 20 to 40 minutes, I was told, when I was invited, and I'm still well within that time, but I will try to finish properly. The fascinating thing about the mind is that it fits like a hand in a glove with the rational universe in which we live. The very fact that something like science exists means that the universe is rational. It is as accessible to our mind. The fact that the universe can be described in mathematical terms and that our minds are capable of carrying out mathematical reasons is to me a very significant fact. It is readily explained on the doctrine of creation, for the rational universe was created by a rational God who placed his own rational image in mankind. On evolutionary explanations, I find no way forward. Well then, Madam President, thank you for your indulgence. What I wish to remind you as I close is simply that I have pitched the debate at the point where science wishes, or evolution, wishes to explain everything in terms of natural process. Theology says no, science is limited, and we need to go beyond natural process for a satisfying explanation of what we know and what we are. And I would suggest that at least in the areas of the four illustrations I have given, that the doctrine of creation is superior to a purely naturalistic theory of evolution. Thank you.